Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 13. This is the last week before Thanksgiving. And so, since I really don't assign you anything to do on Thanksgiving, we really just have a couple weeks of discussion left. And so, what I wanted to do this week is review the concepts that we've talked about this semester. And, and really, this has to do with you as an individual and your own leadership as you prepare to possibly lead a strategic planning effort in an organization that you might be involved with at some point. So let's do that, and let's talk about the concepts and their utility in our own lives. Well, way back when, in week 1, I showed you this slide, and the question was, what is strategic planning? And Bryson, in his 2011 book, says this. He says, it's a deliberative, disciplined approach to producing fundamental decisions and actions that shape and guide what an organization or other entity is, what it does, and why. So these are the things that strategic planning helps an organization do. It helps an organization gather and analyze and synthesize information. So it's really it's a discovery, it's a research effort, really, for an organization. It helps the organization produce judgments for the decision makers about actions they should be taking. It helps the organization understand and address their key organizational issues. It enhances organizational learning. In other words, organizational learning means how an organization really discovers itself and what it's doing right and what it's doing wrong. And it creates this idea of significant and enduring public value. And we'll talk about public value a little bit more in just a minute. So this slide is in your textbook, and I showed you this way in the beginning as well. And strategic planning and really strategic thinking for an organization boiled down is this 3-part action, and it's really kind of simple. It's where we are, where we want to be, and how do we get there. And that is really what strategic planning is all about. And the point is, if an organization doesn't take the time to understand those 3 questions, who are we, who do we want to be, and how are we going to get there, then they're really not engaging in strategic planning. Now, that doesn't mean they won't be successful. Some organizations are successful by accident. Some organizations are successful because they have a monopoly, for example. They have a product that everybody needs. But not all organizations are going to achieve things without strategic thinking and strategic planning. So just keep those 3 questions in mind. I do like this diagram from the book. I think it's one of the most important and simplified diagrams that we can encounter in strategic planning. So I showed you this one too. This is Bryson's 10-step model. You can like this one or not like it. My own personal opinion, and I will give you my opinion, is I think it's fairly complicated for an initial effort. This diagram is in your book as well. I actually like this one a little bit better because it combines some of the steps, and I think in doing so, it makes it easier to understand. Now this diagram, this triangle, is one I actually like a lot, because what it shows is that the strategic planning effort is this building block approach, and it builds up in phases. So we covered we didn't cover all these things. We covered a lot of these things. You recall we covered stakeholder assessment. We talked about mandates. We talked about understanding the environment through a SWOT exercise. And then we talked about strategic issues and having a vision for your organization. And so the idea is that those activities on the bottom tier of the pyramid lead to your ability to do those other things. And so we talked about identifying strategic issues, and we talked about having a vision for the organization. We talked a little bit about a mission statement. Remember, we created a mission statement for the Durham Museum. And we didn't talk too much about values, but really that's one of those questions that an organization needs to ask itself. And actually, understanding your own values is something that can really come up in a SWOT exercise, or, for example, if you do a strategic triangle type exercise, it helps you to understand your values. If you're talking about public value, then what you value is going to come out of that discussion quite naturally. And then finally, up there at the top of the pyramid, we talked about one method of evaluating an organization and monitoring an organization, and that was the balanced scorecard approach. So the point is, we covered almost all these things. We didn't talk too much about budgets and action plans. We didn't talk a lot about the goals and assessments. And this very first step in the lower left-hand corner, the readiness assessment, we didn't really talk about that either. That's really, the readiness assessment is kind of a preliminary step to understanding your own organization if you're ready to do this. But for the most part, we have built this pyramid of strategic planning. So let's talk about a few of the things we have done. And in fact, I'm not going to talk about all of them in this lecture, but I'm going to talk about most of them. So you remember, I think it was week 2, we talked about this idea of mandates, and that was on that pyramid. So as you recall, we talked about mandates are these things, these requirements, restrictions, expectations, pressures, and constraints that face an organization. And we talked about how there are a lot of different kinds of mandates. For example, relevant legislation, policies, ordinances, charters, contracts. These are things that define what an organization must do. And then in the end of this long paragraph, we talked about this really interesting phenomenon, which is that within a lot of organizations, the people in the organization may not even understand what their mandates are. So they don't understand what it is they're supposed to be doing by law, or maybe by custom, or by expectation of the community. So if they don't understand that, then how do they know how well they're doing? And that's the importance of mandates. If you don't understand what it is you're expected to do, really, how do you know that you've done it, and how do you know how well you're doing it? And then the next week, we talked about stakeholders. And who are stakeholders? Stakeholders are these people or groups that have a claim on your organization, on the services or products that your organization delivers. And so here again, we went to lengths to understand who stakeholders are. And here's the exercise we used to do that. Remember, we used this thing called the power interest grid. And this power interest grid told us, it enabled us to break stakeholders into these 4 groups: the subjects, the players, the crowd, and the context setters. And what do those things mean? All stakeholders have some degree of power over our organization, and they have some degree of interest. And so there's a difference between a stakeholder with low power and low interest and a stakeholder with high power and high interest. And that's where those names come from. But it's important for us in the organization to understand who these people are and who these groups are. And you recall from the discussion that we had that week, there wasn't universal agreement on where in those quadrants different stakeholders should be placed. So you recall we talked about Metro, the Omaha bus company, and we didn't all agree on the placement of stakeholders. So that's a really interesting phenomena to me within the organization. if you're in an organization and you're getting ready to try to understand who your stakeholders are, for example, I think it's really realistic to understand that not everybody in the organization is going to define stakeholders in the same way. And it depends a lot on what they do for the organization, and it depends a lot on the people inside your organization, and how they interact with stakeholders. So, for example, one employee may think that the accounting firm, the auditing firm that does your auditing is a very important stakeholder, and somebody else might think they're not really a stakeholder at all. And it just depends on where in the organization you are. So that's another reason why, for a lot of these kinds of exercises, we want consensus and we want to approach these things from a group perspective, if at all possible. Okay, so then later on in the course, we talked about this idea of evaluating your environment. And we used this exercise called the SWOT or the SWOC exercise. And a lot of you are doing this for your term project organization. And so those letters stand for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges, or some people call challenges threats. But the point of the exercise is to understand that strengths and weaknesses are internal and opportunities and challenges are external. And that's how strengths and weaknesses connect, because they're internal, and opportunities and challenges connect to each other because they're external. But then we flip those arrows to the vertical and we understand that strengths and opportunities are both usually relatively positive aspects, and weaknesses and challenges are often negative aspects, right? And then the final thing to understand is that strengths and weaknesses are really in the present. That's a snapshot in time today. We can understand our strengths and weaknesses today. The opportunities and the challenges present themselves in the future. I mean, the future might be tomorrow, but it is in the future. And so an organization does not need to be confined or defined only by its strengths and weaknesses. It has to look to the future and turn those strengths and weaknesses into opportunities and understand the challenges that it will face in the future. And so this slide that we talked about earlier in the semester kind of broke down some of these internal and external environmental factors. So for example, internal to the organization, we have resources. And your resources are your people or your budget or your culture. We have present strategies, and they might be not very good strategies at all, or they might be great strategies. And they might be organized in different ways. And then we have performance. So, this is where things like the balanced scorecard fit in, or other indicators. And then we have these external environmental factors. And there's always going to be external environmental factors, and it's always going to be important for an organization to understand what those things are. What are these forces and trends? I mean, what is going on politically? What is going on economically? Right? A nonprofit organization has to understand what's going on economically, because that is going to affect giving, for example. That's a very basic thing. What are the key resources out there? Who are the clients, customers? Who are the funders? And who are your competitors? And who are your collaborators? So understanding your environment is a really key element of understanding your organization. And so then we got to the point of talking about strategic issues. After defining all those things, after understanding mandates and stakeholders, after understanding the environment, those things all lead to defining then what are the strategic issues that face our organization. And I presented you with this litmus test, this 6-question litmus test. So this is a really important thing to understand. How does this litmus test affect the organization? And are these issues strategic or are they just operational issues? I shouldn't say just operational issues because operational issues can be really serious, but it's important to understand the distinction between strategic issues and operational issues. And then, if you recall our exercise, which I thought was kind of a fun exercise, writing a mission statement for the Durham Museum. And Bryson had these 6 questions about giving an organization help in writing its own mission statement. And I think what we found from that exercise with the Durham Museum is, it isn't easy writing a mission statement. And I recall the discussion and the discussion that you all had with each other. A lot of you picked up on different aspects of what the Durham Museum does. And that was it was a really good organization to use for that because of that. For example, the Durham Museum is in this historic building which used to be Omaha Union Station, and it's a historic landmark, and it's built in the Art Deco style. It's really all this cool stuff, and it's a building worth preserving. And so a lot of you picked up on that as a big part of its mission statement. A lot of you picked up on the educational aspect as the key element of its mission. Some of you picked up on preservation. The Durham Museum does preserve a lot of very valuable artifacts, and as a history museum. And so a lot of you picked up on that as the key element of its mission statement. So once again, we see what I really wanted you to see, which is there's not going to be universal agreement within your organization on what your mission statement is. And so when you organize your strategic planning effort, it's really important to understand that there are many voices in your organization, and they all have to be heard. All these voices have to be heard. Now, at some point, if you're writing a mission statement, you're going to have to decide how you're going to reach consensus, or you might not reach consensus, but you're going to have to decide how you're going to write your mission statement. But I think it's really important to understand that there are various voices within your organization, and they might conflict, but you have to figure out a way to hear them to be effective. And so then we started talking about this thing called the strategic triangle, and we talked about this quite a bit, I think. And we even had a written assignment involving the strategic triangle. And so, in a nutshell, Moore was saying that an organization has to understand what its public value is. What's the substance of its public value, and how that public value is supported by its own capacity and its own legitimacy and support. And so what were these things? So capacity is how's the organization structured to meet its mission, right? And so over there on the right-hand side, you see some of these elements of capacity, like your budget or your personnel, your facilities. And so the manager in that case has to understand capacity and manage downward towards that capacity and understand her own internal customers, and then really, how do I build capacity in my organization? And then there's this issue of legitimacy and support. So this should be thought of as an external factor. The legitimacy and support comes from the outside. Some of it comes from the inside, but most of it comes from the outside, from the authorizing environment. So if you're a government organization, it comes from the laws that set up your organization. But if you're a nonprofit, it's going to come from a lot of the people that fund you, or it's going to come from your clients. So a lot of it comes from the outside. So in this case, the manager is managing, I say upwards, but it's really externally towards the people that legitimize and authorize that organization. And so then finally you get to this idea of public value, which is how does the organization meet its mission? What is the public value that it delivers? So in this case, the manager has to understand conceptually, who are the customers, who are the clients, and what is the value that the organization is delivering. So, um, you know, sometimes the public value itself can be a little bit nebulous. And so in this case, it really is up to the manager to try to define that public value. Even if other people see it differently, it's really important to come to grips with what the manager thinks public value is for the organization. And then I'm going to cycle through these things one more time, because you recall we used the strategic triangle really to talk about the vision. So, you can take that same triangle and you can point it towards the future. So if you actually understood your public value today, then what would it be 5 years from now? What would it be 10 years from now? What's the gap, and how do you fill that gap? And so we can do this with the public value statement. We can do it with the legitimacy and support statement. And here, I think it's really important that what we understand is that the people that support you today might not be there tomorrow. So if you're a nonprofit, for example, how are you going to build that donor base, for example? Do you just assume that the same donors are going to continue to give to your organization year on year on year? Or are you trying to expand your base of support? I think logically you should be expanding your base of support. And then capacity. An organization should be striving to build capacity all the time. The capacity you have today will not support your organization 10 years from now. So how do you build capacity? How do you build your budget? What about facilities? What about staff? I think in the discussion a lot of people talked about training staff. That's a gap in some organizations. If you want to expand your capacity, you have to have the staff and the volunteers to do that. But training is often a gap. So that's something that the organization would have to address. And then finally, we talked about, okay, now we have our organization in place, we have our plan in place, how do we evaluate it? And we talked about the Kaplan and Norton concept of the balanced scorecard. So I think the balanced scorecard, the nice thing about it is what it tries to do is right there in the center of that diagram, it says vision and strategy. And so the vision and strategy is supposed to be the link that links those four perspectives together. The financial perspective, the customer perspective, the learning and growth perspective, and the internal business process perspective. And so I had this diagram in an earlier lecture, and it talked about what these perspectives are. And what this particular diagram did was it tried to compare these perspectives for a typical for-profit organization versus, say, a typical nonprofit organization. But both organizations have these perspectives. Just because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean you don't have a financial perspective. You, of course, have a financial perspective. You're not making a profit, but it doesn't mean you don't care about finances. And so, I just want to stress that every organization, really, their perspectives can be broken down into these four perspectives. And, just like anything else, this is a model. You could think of different perspectives from which to approach things, but these perspectives work pretty well. And again, the idea is to balance them. And I think we talked about that in the discussion, and a lot of you did a really good job on that if one really gets out of whack, it is going to affect the others. And that is why Kaplan and Norton called it the balanced scorecard. So here we are. We're coming up to the discussion for this week, week 13. So how would you plan? And I thought one way to do this, as we're kind of coming to the end of the semester and we've talked about all these things, um, what I'd like to do is get some ideas from you. If you look at all these things I just presented in this lecture, what I'd like you to do is take these things and rank them in terms of what you think are the most applicable to organizations you've been involved with, or organizations you think you're going to be involved with. So understanding mandates, identifying stakeholders, understanding the internal and external environments, understanding the organization's public value using the strategic triangle, evaluating an organization using the balanced scorecard, and understanding strategic issues. Which of these things do you think are the most important? And which do you think are the least important? So rank them from 1 to 6, and no ties. So don't say, yeah, I think they're all important. I want you to think about which you think are the most important. And then after you do that, I want you to explain why you ranked them that way. And then for the final question of this particular discussion, I want you to tell everybody, if you had just one day to lead a strategic planning effort in an organization, what tool would you use? So that's not necessarily these 6 things, but we had some tools that we used throughout the semester in the exercises. What tool would you use, and why would you do that? So you're being brought in as a consultant, to organization XYZ, and you're leading this one-day strategic planning effort. What tool would you use to do that? And so that's the discussion for this week. And I'm really interested in your ideas. As I continue to teach this course, I try to modify it every time to try to make it better and better. And so I am interested in what you as students have to say about this. So that's the discussion. I'm looking forward to what you have to say this week, and thanks for your participation.